And welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This is episode 87, season 2, episode 33, the second to last portion in the book of Leviticus. That is known as the portion of Behar, which means that next week, here in Israel at least, we'll be finishing the book of Leviticus. Our topic this week, the Sabbath. We're not going to take necessarily the idea, the concept of Sabbath in purely the religious sense. We're going to expand it into the concept of rest. The Bible in this week's portion talks about one specific kind of rest, and that is letting the land lay fallow for 1 year. So in a week-to-week structure, we have 6 days of work, and the seventh day is the day of Shabbat, the Sabbath day, and it's a day of no work. And in this week's portion, we get a similar structure, albeit with respect to years, that 6 years you shall work the land, and on the 7th year you shall let the land rest. The land should be fallow. No planting, no growing, no working the land, any of that stuff. Anything that does grow is free and belongs to anyone who can come and take. It's a fascinating commandment, letting the land lay fallow. And then subsequently in this portion is the idea of the Jubilee year. As you're counting 7 years of 7, the 50th year is then a Jubilee, which is an even greater sense of fallow with an additional component really of a reset with respect to ownership and all kinds of other freedoms. So we have really in the Bible the concept of rest as it relates to the week to week and then also year to year kind of an idea. The commandment of letting the land lay fallow is so important and so serious that among the different commentaries and the midrashic exegetical literature, it talks about the idea that one of the reasons why the people were exiled was because they were not careful with the 7th year, what's known in Hebrew, Shemitah, the year of letting the land stay fallow. And because they weren't careful about it and they didn't execute it properly, one of their punishments was that they were no longer allowed to stay on the land. They had to leave. They were exiled. That's how severe it is. It happens to be that this year here in Israel is a 7th year. It is the year of the Shemitah. It is the year of letting the land lay fallow. And so there are many, many, many farmers here who are not working their land this year. And there are many who have leased out their property. They're not working it. They've leased out their property to others who may be. You can imagine how hard that must be. Imagine from a week-to-week basis that when we're working and then we have to stop for the Sabbath day, how hard that is. And what a rush it always feels like in the moments before the Sabbath sets in on a Friday afternoon. Certain times of the year even more difficult, wintertime in certain parts of the world, when the sun sets early on a Friday. You can imagine if it's the case also, if you're a farmer, that if you're working your land for 6 years, to leave it for an entire year, how hard that must be. It is described in literature and commentaries as well as an incredibly difficult commandment to keep. And you can imagine why. You work that land, you've tilled it, whatever it is that it takes, I'm not a farmer, to make that really produce on a year in, year out basis. And then one day just sort of let it go for a year. Pretty much. And to just sort of watch as it grows wildly, as it's not taken care of completely, as other people are coming in and taking in the produce freely during that year, how hard that must be for somebody. But the Bible talks about it. And so what we get is an interesting sort of approach when we think about the idea of a Sabbath, of rest. So we normally think of the concept of the rest on a week-to-week basis, but the Bible is adding an additional component, which is on a year-to-year basis, the idea that at a certain point a person should breathe, should rest. We call that year the sabbatical. Person gets a period of time away. And so we can get the concept, and the different commentaries talk about what the benefit of a sabbatical year is. Some will say that it is for the land itself, the ability for the land to replenish and for the land to recoup the minerals that have been used and reused over the course of time. I can imagine that to be true. Other commentaries talk about the idea that it's not so much about the land itself, but it's about the person, about the people. The opportunity for the person to replenish and rejuvenate during that time, to focus on something else. The idea that in the course of that 7th year, that's a spiritual time for the person, the farmer, that they're not focused on their work, but they're focused on themselves. Further commentaries talk about the idea that sabbatical, or that concept, isn't just about replenishment for the self, but it's really replenishment for the soul, and it's really focused on faith and belief. Because as you read further in the text this week, you read about the idea that if a person is going to let their field lay fallow for a year, have a sabbatical year, then what are they going to do in the 8th year, or year 1 in the next new cycle? How do they handle that? And so the Bible seems to be implying that there's a component here in the sabbatical about faith and belief and trust in God. And I imagine it to be the case that all of these things are true. All of them are reasons to have this. All of them are reasons to have this sense of Sabbath, of rest, of a sabbatical in one's life. And so moving over slightly from the religious sense of it, interestingly enough, look across the spectrum. It seems to me that almost every religion has a concept of Sabbath, sabbatical built into it, of a time of rest, a time of replenishment. But stepping out of that, the question really is then for us, is how do we bring Sabbath, sabbatical, rest into our own lives? And so we know that it's become fairly popular for people to impose on themselves something called a digital Sabbath. 1 day a week, 24 hours, no technology. Putting the phone away, going to turn the computer off, no email, no social media, none of that. We get the idea. We are so in it. We're steeped in it day to day, week to week. It's sort of the sense that it controls our entire world, and that if we don't stop, even for a moment, it's going to be a problem. And so we see that people talk a lot about the idea of a digital Sabbath. And people talk about whether or not digital Sabbath works or it doesn't work. What exactly does it mean? Does it actually stay for 24 hours? Does it sort of creep back? I remember reading an article some time ago about somebody who tried a digital Sabbath, and then when it was that he and his family wanted to go somewhere, they couldn't use the GPS. And so they printed out in advance of the Sabbath, and their imposed Sabbath, they printed out the directions on paper. That was the first week. And then the second week, they're like, you know what? We should be able to use the Waze and be able to use the technology for that, but we're not going to. And so how does it work and how does it last if you're constantly and consistently violating it in some way, shape, or form? But we're all sort of in agreement that the body and the soul and the mind need rest. And there are a lot of ways that people get there, that they get that replenishment, that rest, that time to recoup in their lives. And so I mentioned a few weeks ago, there's this idea, and that's very popular now. I mentioned certainly the person who has coined the phrase, what's called NSDR by Dr. Andrew Huberman, is what's called non-sleep deep rest. It's a certain kind of approach to establishing a certain level of calm through focus in the mind. So even though the person isn't sleeping, they are resting deeply. And that the ability to do that for periods of time in the course of one's life. But the reality of it is that each and every single one of us does need to rest, does need to have time in their lives where they slow down, where they give themselves the space to breathe, where they give themselves the time to appreciate what it is that they're doing. It gives themselves the time to think about what they are focused on and what they are not focused on. So the reality of the way in which our world works is that it's so frenetic and it's so busy that we think that if we rest, here's the quote, if we rest, we rust. I saw that in a blog somewhere, loved it. And that if we're not always on the move, on the go, every second of the day, that somehow we're less than. And somehow it's not enough. And that somehow we haven't accomplished enough because we're not constantly on the go. And if we rest, we rust. It's simply not true. My father, I remember when growing up, used to quote his grandfather, who said, if you can't make it in 6, you can't make it in 7. I always thought that was a great quote. The idea was that if you can't make that success happen in 6 days in the week, if you think you can make it by adding the 7th day of the week, it's wrong. And we think that that's the case, that if I only work an additional day, if I only put in more time, and so on and so forth, then I'll actually get the result that I need. But the reality sometimes is the exact opposite. That we need to stop sometimes, a little bit of patience sometimes, and give it a little bit of space to breathe on its own and allow ourselves to focus on some other things, even ourselves, for a few minutes, maybe even an entire day, and then come back. We won't rust in one day. In my own personal life, I can't imagine life without the Sabbath day. I don't know how people do it. They don't have a 7th day or one day in the week where they're just off, where they're completely separate and disconnected from all that sort of controls or manifests or exists in their lives the rest of the week. And so that 7th day, that time to rest, isn't just sleep or relaxation. It's a mental break. It's a refocus. It's a shifting of the mind to something else. It's an ability to think about other things. It's an ability to separate from what we think is important to perhaps allow what actually is important enter into our own lives. It allows us to go deeper on that day than we probably do most of the time during the rest of the week. I mentioned last year a bunch of times a book called Deep Work. The ability to have sets of time during the course of the day when a person is deeply focused on what it is that they're working on so that they can accomplish at a much deeper, more valuable level. Not shallow, but deep. There's also a concept of deep time. The ability of a person to focus deeply on the things that are important or actually valuable and meaningful in one's own life. That might actually be beyond work. That's other people. That's personal values, spirit, soul, mind. And so it's important to sort of think about how to do this and actually to almost impose it in one's life. Because digital Sabbath as a concept is a beautiful concept. And the ability to build time into one's life that is set aside, separate, is focused, is Sabbath in its way, is monumentally important. We need to have it. And so even if it is the case that as a person we don't have a ritualized situation of a Sabbath day, the question is, how do you bring that kind of space into your own life? How do you build time in your own life for the things that ultimately are perhaps the most valuable in your life, or the people that are the most valuable in your life. How do you do that? When do you do that? And in coaching, part of what I do with people when we talk to them directly is to sometimes to get away from it. Allow your mind to wander. Allow your mind to focus on some other things. So you're able to come back to it refreshed with a new set of eyes. It's a super important approach to things. So the first thing I want to think about from a practical standpoint, how to do this, is that this has to almost become ritualized in one's life. I thought personally, and this is where I have failed at this to some degree, that if I simply calendared it, it would become true. And that if I started to practice it, it would become true as well. But it hasn't worked to the degree that I wanted to. I've actually corrupted it and violated something that's known as time boxing of late more than before, whereas where I've set part of the morning to myself. So for me, that's obviously waking up, that's prayer, that's trying to eat a decent breakfast, that did include exercise, that was supposed to include some time set aside for me learning, studying, and did not include work. But of late, I have completely destroyed it, and I miss that time of the day. It's boxed out on my calendar. It's a concept that I saw in a book called Indistractable by Nir Eyal, if you've ever heard of him. And it's the idea of time boxing, of setting aside the time in your life for yourself, for your family, and for your work. And to sort of try to have those things not overlap, but to have those three separate, sacred for themselves, and buy-in for themselves. And then you can create your day in such a manner that you're prioritizing each one, giving each one the time that it needs, and giving yourself that time is your personal Sabbath, is your personal rest, is your personal fallow. And it's super important that we actually appreciate it. Because what ultimately happens with the idea of a Sabbath, when we ritualize it, then it becomes more than just something that we think we should do. It's more than just a habit. It becomes a given. So the Sabbath day for the religious community is a given. It's coming. You're preparing for it. You're not going to violate it. It's there. So it makes it easier to sort of have it because you know it's coming. There's nothing else you can do about it. But if we're setting that up for ourselves, we have to almost ritualize it. And so it has to become super valuable. We have to see and appreciate its impact and the fruit of that time spent on ourselves to actually then move it from an idea to a calendar to a habit to a ritual. What ends up happening is that when we build something like this into our lives, we build rest into our lives, we build Sabbath into our lives, that kind of concept into our lives. So there's so many benefits of it. It's a quote, I saw this, I couldn't believe it. It's in a blog called Becoming Minimalist, where it really preaches the idea of really removing a lot of the extra in our lives, the stuff in our lives, and all that other, and focus on the values. At the end of this blog, he quotes Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, who's known in the Jewish community as the Vilna Gaon, who's a tremendous, tremendous leader and scholar. It's even hard to describe. He quotes as follows. I have to find the original. It's definitely not in English. What we create becomes meaningful to us only once we stop creating it and start to think about why we did so. If we don't have that time in our lives, we just simply lose. We lose what the value is. We lose the impact that it's having on us. We lose what it is that we actually did. We lose the ability to reflect. We lose the balance. We lose on our production because we simply cannot go at that space. And so it's important to appreciate when we plus minus the value of having this rest in our lives, we lose sight of what's important. And so it's vital for us to build something like this into our daily structures, to appreciate that we deserve it more than simply the fact that we need it, and to appreciate how beneficial something like rest, sabbatical, Sabbath is to us. and to simply end with a quote from one of the great philosophers of the 1980s, who I have yet to mention in almost 2 years of coaching with the Bible, is Ferris Bueller. And he said, life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it. The concept of rest, the concept of Sabbath, the concept of recouping on our personal minerals and our personal energies, on resetting sometimes, is that when we don't, we miss out on what we did. We miss out on what happened. And it's important for us to keep, as we continue to keep going through life and to work through life and to continue to try to succeed, is that at certain moments in the time, almost ritualized, we have to stop. We have to recoup. We have to think. We have to take stock. We have to give ourselves the ability to recuperate and the ability to make life even better than it has been till this moment. That is Coaching with the Bible for this week. See you next week as we close out the third book of the 5 books of Moses. Have a good one.